Hello everyone. Thank you for joining today's session. Today we will be discussing about how to configure SoftwareAG WebMethods API Portal using Docker. Now Docker is a convenient option to actually set up a SoftwareAG WebMethods API Portal, as the API Portal comprises of many moving components, and it makes it easier to use Docker directly to set up and consume an API portal. Let's get into what are the next steps required to achieve this. So the agenda of what all things we'll be going through are the following. First, we will be actually configuring the Docker settings. We'll be subscribing for an API portal license. It's a trial license. You would then actually download the scripts necessary to set up and run an API portal. Subsequently, you'll get a Docker Compose file, and you use this file to actually spin up the API portal. So in the case of the API portal, you don't have a image from which you can just directly start using the product. Instead, you get a set of scripts which is used to actually generate a Docker file, and then you spin up the containers. Finally, we will run the API portal, and then we will log in into the portal to show that we can actually work from a container. So what are the prerequisites? First off, you would need an Docker that is installed and running. You would need a valid username and password for the website hub.docker.com. And finally, you need cgywin shell for Windows. Now I'm using Git Bash as part of my installation of Git. People use different cgywins to actually work with Linux scripts in Windows. You would need this because the scripts that get downloaded as part of the prior steps are Linux scripts, so you really can't just generate the compose file from Windows. Most of that will become clear as we go through the next steps. So you really need to have a Git Bash or something like cgywin, some emulator to actually execute shell scripts from Windows if you're using Windows. Now, if you're using Linux, you don't have any of these problems. You just need to make sure you have your Docker and you have a valid account with hub.docker.com. Next, we need to actually increase the memory of the Docker to at least 8 GB. 8 GB is pretty much the bare minimum you need to execute and run API portal. Anything more than that is always great. You could go directly to the Docker desktop and increase the memory to 8 GB. Alternatively, you can go to your Hyper-V if you're on a Windows box and just directly increase the memory to 8 GB from the Docker desktop panel. The next step is pretty much similar to how we were doing it for the API gateway. You access the hub.docker.com, log in successfully with your username and password, then you access the SoftwareAG API Portal repository. Following that, you click on proceed to checkout. You would have to fill a form with a couple of questions. Once that is done, you'll actually subscribe for a trial license. Trial license is valid for 90 days, but you can always renew and keep working with the trial license. So what you see is me successfully completing registration, and I have now a valid API portal trial license. The next step is actually to download the API portal scripts. Now you'd be really thinking, why would I be doing a download of scripts when I'm actually working with a container? The thing about API portal is there are a bunch of images that you have to start to work with. So the way SoftwareAG has organized it by giving you a set of scripts to generate a Docker file for Windows or Linux. Now all of my demonstration is on a Windows, so these are the steps you need to do to actually download the scripts. First off, you need to log in, Docker login, put in your username and password. So only if you go to this step would you be able to download the subscription license. The next step is on your Windows machine to create any folder, any working folder, because all your scripts are going to be placed in this folder. So in this case, I have made a folder called API-Docker, but you could name it anything you want. And next is the command to actually download the scripts. This is the script provided from the SoftwareAG documentation to actually download the scripts. As you can see, I'm placing the scripts in a folder called API-Docker. Once you have executed the script using the highlighted command, it will run in a couple of seconds and you'll get back a bunch of folders in your directory. So if you navigate to API Docker directory, you can see that it has a bunch of folders called compose, enhancements, and scripts. Now this is our working directory from where we will actually start generating the compose file. So we'll move on to a couple more steps to actually be able to generate the Docker file. So what we have to do is modify the .env file. So what you see right now is the env file after the download is completed. All that you have to do is replace the aris-DockerSetupBase with the path to the folder. Now, honestly speaking, this is not a step as per the documentation, and it would work without this, but for some reason I have not been able to get around it without setting up this path. So once you have set the path of enhancements path to API Docker/enhancements, or whichever directory you had created in the prior step, this would be necessary. Now the next thing is where our Linux emulator or cgywin shell is required. You will have to open up the cgywin shell and set the environment variable for arisDockerSetupBase. Now it's quite natural to think that you could set this up first without modifying the .env. For some reason I've tried this and this never worked. The only way it has worked was by directly modifying the .env file and as well as setting the environment variable. Now these two steps are very critical and important. Unless you have done this, the following steps wouldn't work. So you need to make sure that these changes have been completed. You can see over here I'm using emulator Linux shell emulator that actually exports the environment variable. Here I'm using git bash and my working directory is the API Docker. So you set the environment variable, and these two prerequisites are pretty much everything you need to continue generating the Docker file. So the next step is to actually generate a Docker file. You would have to actually navigate to the folder compose under the API Docker directory and execute the command as shown in the picture. So it's create compose for parameters.sh followed by the argument API. Now this would take a couple of seconds, wouldn't take too long because it doesn't actually download the image. Just takes a couple of seconds, and once you have executed this, you would get back a response saying that your docker compose.yaml file is generated, and this would be an indication that you have successfully been able to create the Docker file. Next step and the final step is to actually run the API portal. It's a simple step once you have gone through all the others, Docker compose and the argument for API to bring it up. Now you'll see that this takes a significant amount of time to actually bring up all the components. Once all the components are up and running, you can see that all of them will be mentioned as done, and you would really have to wait for some time to actually access the API portal. Although it says done, I would still suggest to do a Docker PS to see if all the instances or all the containers are healthy and they are available for consumption. Now the next step is to actually log into the API portal. Now you can't directly go to the API portal because the users are not actually valid. So the first step you have to do is to go to the management console, user management console, which is accessible at localhost UNC. You get a login prompt, and you can log in using the username super user as the username and the password as super user. I'll give you the details in the description. Once you have actually logged in using the super user, you can go and create more users that are accessible on the API portal. Once you've succeeded in creating users from the management console, you can then go to the API portal, and this is the home page of the API portal where you can actually log in using the created user and password. Note that none of the default users initially work, so you will have to actually create a username and password and then access it over here. So let's now look at each step in detail. So the first step that we need to perform is actually a Docker login. Now, if you are already logged in, it will just say you've successfully logged in. Otherwise, you would actually have to put in your username and password. It's actually to create a folder called API-Docker. As you can see, I'm already in the directory called API_Docker, API-Docker. And if I do dir, you see it's empty. Now I'm going to actually execute the command docker rm and docker run with the folder where the files are going to be downloaded. As you can see, I've used API-Docker, and the files are going to be actually downloaded and placed over here. So let's execute this. So after the script is executed, you can see a bunch of folders are actually created in this directory called compose, enhancements, and scripts. So this is the place where we are actually going to start making the remaining modifications to be able to generate the Docker compose file. So now the next step is actually to go to the folder API Docker compose, and the file is .env. We need to modify this file to point the aris-DockerSetupBase to the absolute path. So since this is a Windows box, but we are going to use the script from a Linux shell, we point directly accordingly. So this is the only change you have to make in this file. And just be careful about the folder. It's API Docker compose.env. So you just have to modify this value over here to the folder name where the file is actually residing. So the next step is to open up cgywin emulator or a Linux emulator and navigate to the compose directory. As you can see right now, I'm inside the compose directory within API Docker. Then fire in the command to actually set the path. As you can see, I have used the export command to set the path for aris-docker. This is because it's a Linux based shell, and you have to set the path for API Docker. So once the environment variable has been set and has been exported in the Linux shell, the next command we would fire is to create the compose for parameter.sh and pass the argument API. This would now actually run the shell script and create the Docker compose file. which will then be used in the subsequent steps. As you can see at the end, the Docker Compose file has been created inside the API Docker folder, and this can now be used to move to the next step. So now we are back at the Windows command prompt, and this is the last step to actually spin up the containers from the compose file that was just generated in the previous shell script. So we fire the command, and this would actually start creating the necessary volumes. It actually is persistent, so it creates the volumes, then it creates each and every container that is required for the API portal to come up. Now if you see, actually it is running the containers, but it takes some time for all of them to become healthy. So I'm just going to fire docker ps, and you can see all the containers that have been spinned up. As you can see, most of them are still only starting, and this takes sufficient time to actually come up and be up and running. So I would advise at this stage to take a break, give it a couple of minutes for all the components to be running. So I'll come back and we'll check again once all the components are up and running. Close to 5 minutes, and as you can see, when I hit docker ps, all the components are in a healthy state. So as you can see, there are this many containers that have been spinned up on Kibana, Zookeeper, Cloud Search, Elasticsearch. All of these are the components that you would have to install independently. Step, since all the components are running, is to access the user management console, and as you can see, the URL to access it is localhost UMC. Right now the only user that works is super user. The username is super user, the password is super user. If you do login, you can see that these are the system users, and here you have to actually grant permission to or allow another user such that you can access the portal. So I'm going to log out from here now, and on the next tab, as you see, I've accessed localhost, and this takes you to the home page of the API portal. If you click on login and you try super user over here, it wouldn't work actually. So you have to come on the UMC admin, log in with super user, and create a new user. So let's try one user and create from here. So I've actually created a user successfully, and right now there are no privileges granted to the user. I'm going to actually access the user management console as the super user once more and log in. As you can see, the user I recently created, ME, has no privileges or any groups assigned. I'm going to directly grant all the groups that are there in the API portal to the user. This just makes it easy for me to demonstrate that the user can log in. Now once I navigate back, you can see that the user has all the groups and has inherited the necessary privileges. I'm going to log out as the super user. On the second tab, I have opened the home page of API portal. Here I can now try to log in with the user. And as you can see, I have now successfully logged into the portal. If you go to the panel on the right side, you can see I have all the permissions and privileges of a super user. That's because I have granted myself elevated access. I have now logged in. Now I'm going to actually access the administration panel I can actually go into manage APIs. However, there are no APIs right now, and therefore there isn't much that I can do. But with this, you can now see that I'm able to actually log into the UMC admin console and granted a user privilege to log in into the API portal. And from here, I can now log out from the application. So as you can see, I have now concluded the installation and configuration of the API portal using Docker. The steps are quite simple if you just follow them. I hope you were able to enjoy this session. If you'd like to have answers to any questions, you can post in your comments. And if you like this channel, please subscribe for more videos. Thank you and see you soon.